Hello everyone, welcome back to History 1152. In this video, we're going to discuss America in the 1980s. In many ways, American life in the 1980s was a direct reaction to and a repudiation of American life and values in the 1970s. The 70s had been a decade of disillusionment for many Americans. The failure of Vietnam, economic stagnation, Watergate, and the capture of American citizens in Iran filled many with anger and discontent. American life in the 1980s was a direct reaction against these problems, as Americans looked to remedy the challenges of the previous decade. The 1980 presidential election was a clear attempt by American politicians to reverse the problems that the nation had faced in the 1970s. This put the embattled incumbent, President Jimmy Carter, at a disadvantage. While Carter was a very principled man, presiding over the nation during 4 years of economic privation and foreign policy challenge, had severely damaged his mandate for re-election. Voters still remembered his infamous crisis of confidence speech, in which he called for Americans to sacrifice for the good of the country. The problem was, Americans were already making sacrifices, and the last thing they wanted was to be told that they needed to do even more. As I said in the last video, Carter also angered many of his supporters in the Democratic Party as well, alienating himself from the people who helped him get elected. The Democratic parties were especially divided, as Carter fought against Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy, brother of former President John F. Kennedy. Kennedy had the right last name, had supported important legislation like the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which ended all national quotas on immigration, and he had no trouble attacking Carter's record. He was undone, though, by campaign blunders, and because his reputation was also severely damaged by the Chappaquiddick incident, in which Kennedy had crashed his car into a body of water while driving under the influence of alcohol back in 1969. The passenger, a young woman named Mary Jo Kopechne, died as a result of the crash. Kennedy had not reported the accident until the next day. The incident severely damaged Kennedy's reputation, and it was probably the reason he was never able to mount a successful presidential campaign. On the Republican side, California Governor Ronald Reagan became the Republican nominee for president. He won the primaries and beat out several other candidates, including John B. Anderson, who would go on to run as a third-party candidate in the 1980 election, and George H.W. Bush, who would become Reagan's VP. Before getting into politics, Reagan had worked as a film actor, and he had initially been a member of the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. Over time, though, Reagan began to shift to the political right, believing that communists had compromised many of the liberal organizations he had once supported. By 1964, Reagan was working as a campaign surrogate for the Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater, whom we talked about before. Reagan gained national fame in the 1964 campaign, leading the Republican Party to support his run for governor of California. As governor of California from 1967 to 1975, Reagan supported both liberal and conservative policies. Reagan ran in the Republican primaries in 1976, but lost to the incumbent Gerald Ford, whom we discussed in a previous video. When 1980 came around, Reagan ran again, but this time he won his party's nomination and the general election as well. What issues did the candidates run on in the 1980 election? Carter ran on his strength as an incumbent, which was fairly weak, and he tried to show that he could free the American hostages from their captivity in Iran. When it became clear that Carter would not run on his record, though, and that his plans to free the hostages had stalled, Carter adopted a more negative, pessimistic campaign that focused on attacking Reagan. Reagan, in contrast, ran a much more positive campaign, and while he did attack Carter's record on a variety of issues, He tried to offer solutions that he believed would fix the U.S. economy, bolster America's weakened reputation abroad, and lead to the return of the American hostages. Reagan promised to lower taxes as a way to stimulate economic growth, while also promising to spend more on defense, ostensibly so that the Soviet Union would take the U.S. more seriously. Reagan also talked about reining in the power of the federal government and giving more control to the states as well. Reagan's message resonated with conservative people from a variety of backgrounds. His message was popular with most Republicans, even as he moved the party further to the right than it had been during the Nixon and Ford years. Reagan also garnered support from Southern conservatives, who found that the Democratic Party was moving further to the left. Reagan did not promise to reinstitute segregation or the Jim Crow laws, but his talk about states' rights would have resonated with Southern conservatives who disapproved of the federal government for its role in ending laws that discriminated against African Americans. Reagan expressed his support for states' rights at the Neshoba County Fair in Mississippi during the election. Neshoba County had been the site of the murder of 3 civil rights workers in 1964. Reagan talked about states' rights, specifically when it came to education and community involvement. Carter and critics of Reagan argued that his invocation of the term states' rights in Neshoba County was a direct attempt to gain support of former segregationists and white supremacists in general. Reagan was also accused of racism and so-called dog whistle tactics for his criticism of welfare recipients, referring to the Cadillac-driving welfare queens and the strapping young bucks buying T-bone steaks with food stamps. For years, Reagan had referenced the Linda Taylor case. Taylor was an African-American woman who had engaged in at least $100,000 worth of welfare fraud in the 1970s, among other alleged criminal acts. Reagan referenced her case multiple times and frequently exaggerated the amount of money she had embezzled. Carter and Reagan's opponents claimed that Reagan continuously talked about Taylor and welfare fraud because he was a racist, or that he was trying to court racist voters. Reagan's conservative defenders, though, argued that Reagan attacked welfare because he saw it as a big government program that could be easily abused, and that racism was not what inspired his criticism. Reagan declared that he was not a racist, and that he wanted to help black people, especially those living in inner cities. Reagan, a Californian, also insinuated that Carter was a racist because he was a Southerner, although Reagan usually preferred to run a more positive campaign, focus on what he would do to turn the country around, rather than attacking his opponent as his main strategy. While Reagan initially struggled, due to several speaking gaffes and a press that was generally more friendly to Carter, he closed the gap and eventually went on to win the election in November. Reagan narrowly won the popular vote, gaining about 50.7% of the vote share. But he won resoundingly in the Electoral College, winning all but 6 states and the District of Columbia. Carter, to his credit, had won his home state of Georgia, but he had lost the rest of the South, except for West Virginia, although people debate whether West Virginia should be considered a southern state. There were many reasons that Americans from across the country chose to vote for Reagan over Carter in the 1980 election. While Carter had come across as pessimistic about America's future, Reagan seemed to be more optimistic. While Carter was seen as weak and passive, primarily for his handling of the Iranian hostage crisis, Reagan promised strength on the world stage and an end to the indignities against America and its citizens. Reagan also promised to fix the economy by lowering taxes, a promise that resonated with Americans, while Carter had asked Americans to sacrifice in difficult times. Finally, Reagan was able to build a coalition of conservative people from a variety of backgrounds, even if some have argued that he used racist language to do so. Reagan was inaugurated on January 20th, 1981, the same day that the release of the U.S. hostages was completed. The U.S. had given the Iranian government about 50 tons of gold as payment and had agreed not to pursue further action against Iranian affairs in the future. and Iran dropped their demand that the U.S. apologize to them. Iran had dropped this and several other more humiliating demands as a result of mounting pressure from the Iran-Iraq War, among other factors. While Carter had been the primary U.S. negotiator, Reagan in later years would be associated with the hostages' return. Some have speculated that Reagan may have tried to sabotage the hostage negotiations in an October surprise to keep Carter from being reelected, although the evidence for this is minimal and is more of a conspiracy theory, much like the Kennedy assassination and additional shooters. The release of the hostages started Reagan's presidency off on a positive note, although Reagan's momentum would be slowed by an assassination attempt in which he was severely wounded. He ultimately survived because of his good physical health and because he had received medical treatment quickly. The would-be assassin, John Hinckley Jr., suffered from serious mental illness and was motivated by his psychological disorder, rather than politics or foreign influence, as was the case with other presidential assassins. During his first term as president, Reagan worked to strengthen the American economy through a decentralized economic plan, a form of supply-side economics that would be dubbed Reaganomics. As a type of supply-side economics, Reaganomics called for the lowering of taxes, the slashing of regulations, and the weakening of the public sector. Even as Reagan lowered taxes and cut government spending, he called for the expansion of the U.S. defense budget as a way to counter the Soviet Union and show that America was not passive. Reagan and his supporters pointed to the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan and the recent hostage crisis with Iran to show that Carter's strategy of openness and détente had made the U.S. appear weaker. Reaganomics had the effect of increasing the national gross domestic product and led to an average GDP growth of 3.4% over Reagan's first term. Inflation also decreased from an average of about 12% to about 4%, giving Americans more spending power with their currency. Reagan also hoped to return the U.S. to the gold standard as well, in order to prevent inflation in the future. The biggest problem, though, with Reaganomics was that the national debt increased significantly due to the lowering of tax revenue and the decreased defense budget. Critics of Reaganomics also argue that Reagan's plan, while it enriched the wealthy and the middle class, hurt the poor and working class by threatening unions and government programs designed to mitigate poverty. They also argued that Reaganomics benefited the wealthy far more than it did all other classes, dubbing the plan trickle-down economics, as Reagan called for the freezing of the minimum wage, while also cutting federal expenditures on public assistance that went to local areas by up to 60%. Although Reaganomics had caused GDP to increase, it worked slowly, and the recession that the country had been in since the 1970s did not really end until 1982. Other policies that Reagan supported in his first term included taking a harder line against the Soviet Union and more action against drug use in the USA, intensifying the so-called war on drugs. Reagan called for more resources to fight the illegal drug trade in 1982 in response to the growing popularity of crack cocaine and the perceived crack epidemic. Reagan called for more resources for law enforcement organizations to fight the trade, sale, and use of drugs, but also increased drug treatment and public awareness campaigns against drugs as well. First Lady Nancy Reagan would also play a major role in these anti-drug awareness campaigns as well, popularizing the "just say no" phrase that was taught to American school students across the country. The war on drugs would intensify during Reagan's second term, with the addition of mandatory minimum penalties for drug offenders. Critics of the war on drugs have argued that increased enforcement of drug laws was expensive and ineffective, and that the decreased drug use in the 1980s, primarily marijuana, had been prompted by other factors rather than the intensified implementation of anti-narcotics laws. Other critics argued that Reagan's war on drugs, particularly its focus on crack cocaine, was racist, and that it disproportionately targeted African Americans. Although it should be noted that many African Americans had initially supported the war on drugs as a way of removing drug dealers from their communities. Many of the anti-drug policies of the Reagan administration are still in effect today and will certainly remain controversial for years to come. As part of taking a more aggressive stance against the USSR, Reagan referred to the Soviet Union as an evil empire in 1983. He condemned the Soviets not only for their anti-democratic policies and human rights abuses, but also for their communist ideology as well. The speech and its condemnation of the Soviet Union and communism would come to be known as the Reagan Doctrine, and would lead to the policy of rollback of the Soviet Union. In contrast to the détente strategy of the 1970s, which called for a balance of power between the USSR and the US, rollback, true to its name, entailed the retreat and ultimate dissolution of the Soviet Union, even going beyond the Truman-era strategy of containment. To this end, the Reagan administration would support anti-Soviet and anti-communist resistance movements across the world. Most notably, Reagan continued the support of the Mujahideen insurgents who resisted the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. Under Reagan, the U.S. provided arms, materiel, and training for the Mujahideen. Reagan even met with Mujahideen leaders in the Oval Office in 1983. The Mujahideen were partially inspired to resist the Soviets because of their support of Islamic fundamentalism. Even though similar beliefs had inspired the Iranian Revolution, Reagan believed that it was more important to support the enemies of the Soviet Union. In 1983, Reagan had also supported the U.S. invasion of Grenada, an island nation in the Caribbean, which had fallen to a Marxist-Leninist coup in 1979. The intervention, codenamed Operation Urgent Fury, was the first major military invasion the U.S. had engaged in since the Vietnam War. Reagan justified the invasion, arguing that the establishment of such a left-leaning state would encourage the Soviets to increase their presence in the Caribbean, and that American citizens living in Grenada needed to be protected as well. The invasion was a success, with the U.S. and other Caribbean nations defeating the communist government, which was receiving support from the USSR, Cuba, North Korea, and East Germany. Reagan also sent U.S. troops as part of an international peacekeeping force to Lebanon during the Lebanese Civil War. During the intervention, the U.S. Marines barracks in Beirut was attacked by a suicide bomber, and 241 Americans were killed. In retaliation, Reagan ordered the USS New Jersey to bombard Syrian positions in Lebanon, and then withdrew the Marines from the country. In 1983, Reagan also proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, which called for ground and space-based technologies to shoot down potential Soviet ballistic missile launches. The SDI made many Soviet leaders nervous, who began a spending-based arms race against the U.S. Domestic critics of the SDI dubbed the program Star Wars, after the popular science fiction movie franchise. In retrospect, the SDI and the spending plans which it prompted from the Soviet Union contributed to the USSR's eventual collapse, even as the plan proved very expensive for the United States. In spite of the criticism that Reagan received for his economic plan and for stepping up the drug war, Reagan ran for president in 1984 with a strong mandate. Pointing to the ongoing economic recovery and the U.S. athletes' successes in the 1984 LA Olympics, Reagan promised people of the U.S. that it was morning in America. Reagan ran against Walter Mondale, a Democratic politician from Minnesota, and former President Jimmy Carter's VP. Reagan struggled in the first televised debate, where he appeared confused and beleaguered, leading many to suggest that Reagan was unfit to be president for another term. Reagan had been the oldest man to be elected president until the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and he had been the oldest person to run for presidency until the campaign of Joe Biden in 2020. Reagan was inaugurated in 1981, just before his 70th birthday, and he was going on 74 during the 84 election. Reagan performed better in later debates, and made light of the criticisms he had received for his advanced age. Reagan ran on the economic growth that the country had experienced in the early 1980s, whereas Mondale ran on a liberal platform and promised to continue or advance many of the liberal policies of the 1960s and 1970s. Reagan kept George H.W. Bush, the incumbent VP, as his running mate, and Mondale chose Geraldine Ferraro, a Democratic representative from New York, as his VP. Ferraro was the first female vice presidential candidate for a major political party in the U.S. Running on his record as president, Reagan won resoundingly in the 1984 election. Reagan won nearly 59% of the popular vote and won 49 of 50 states in the electoral vote landslide. Mondale won only his home state of Minnesota. Reagan's overwhelming victory in the South, Midwest, and Northeast has been credited in part to the so-called Reagan Democrats, Southern conservatives and blue-collar whites in the North, people who had voted Democrat for most of the 20th century, voting for Reagan, believing that the Democratic Party had abandoned them. We talked about this group of people in our lecture on the 1970s. Although he was a conservative, Reagan won the youth vote in what was termed the Reagan Revolution, as Generation X voters were coming of age and repudiating many of the liberal values of the baby boomers. Reagan had also won the white evangelical Christian vote as well in 1984, just as he had in 1980. Reagan himself did not fit the profile of the typical evangelical believer. He was a former actor from California and had been married multiple times. But he did identify himself as an Orthodox, born-again Christian. Reagan had also supported a constitutional amendment to allow prayer in public schools, even a mandate for it, an issue that resonated with religious evangelical Christians. Reagan's rhetoric about the evil of the Soviet Union and the U.S.'s mandate to face and defeat the Soviets appealed to conservative Christian voters as well, who saw the generations fight against the secular USSR as a religious struggle. During his second term, Reagan continued to put pressure on the Soviet Union. He continued to increase defense spending as well as the expansion of the SDI. The Soviet Union, under Premier Mikhail Gorbachev, struggled to keep up. A series of factors had severely weakened the USSR in the 1970s and 1980s. Collective agriculture and manufacturing meant that the Soviet economy was not as responsive to change as the more decentralized U.S. economic system was. Additionally, oil prices fell in 1985, greatly lowering the profitability of one of the USSR's most important exports. The ongoing Soviet-Afghan War proved an expensive and bloody conflict for the USSR and provoked great social unrest, much like the Vietnam War had done in the US back in the 1960s and early 1970s. The Soviet government censored the press and tried to keep the people in the dark about why the war was happening and why their sons were coming back dead, even resorting to welding the bodies of dead soldiers into zinc coffins, so that families could not see the wounds that had killed their relatives. The nuclear disaster at Chernobyl in 1986 was also a factor. Although fewer than 100 people died in the initial meltdown and in containing the radiation leak, thousands more would die over the next several years, weakening the Soviet state and causing it to lose prestige on the international stage. Reagan believed that these pressures would make the USSR more open to democracy and free speech, and that these measures that he was taking against the Soviet Union, combined with the struggles the Union was facing, would lead to the independence of the Soviet satellite states and the breakup, or at least the reform, of the USSR, what Premier Gorbachev had called glasnost and perestroika. In a series of summits with Gorbachev and in public speeches, Reagan called for reform of the Soviet Union. In a speech at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, Reagan implored Gorbachev to tear down this Berlin Wall and allow free passage between communist East Berlin and capitalist West Berlin. East Berlin would allow free passage to the West in November of 1989, and the wall's demolition would follow. Although Reagan generally has a reputation for being aggressive with the Soviet Union, which he certainly was, he did sign several nuclear disarmament treaties, including the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces (INF) Treaty and the Strategic Arms Reduction (START) Treaty. On the more aggressive side, though, Reagan's administration also launched attacks on Libya, which was ruled by military dictator Muammar Gaddafi, after a Libyan terrorist attack in Berlin had killed 63 American military personnel. Most of the U.S. public supported these attacks, alongside the agreements and treaties that Reagan was making with the Soviet Union. While many people supported Reagan's efforts to roll back the Soviet Union, other foreign policy measures taken by the Reagan administration were more controversial. The most notable of these contentious policies was the Iran-Contra scandal. In the Iran-Contra Affair, the U.S. government planned to sell arms to Iran, a violation of its own embargo against the country, in exchange for help returning several American hostages to from the Iran-backed paramilitary, some would consider terrorist organization, Hezbollah, who had captured American citizens. The U.S. would also get money out of the deal, which would then be sent to the Contras. The proceeds from these arms would then be used by the Contra rebels of Nicaragua, fronted to them through the CIA. The Contras were attempting to overthrow the left-wing Sandinista government of Nicaragua. The Sandinistas worked to mitigate poverty and promote gender equality, but they had also been criticized for mass executions and human rights abuses, especially against indigenous people. Reagan himself supported the Contras' cause, but claimed to have no part in the Iran-Contra scandal. The Contras would continue their civil war against Nicaragua and its government, the Sandinistas, until 1989, leading to new elections in which the Sandinistas lost power. While the U.S. had worked to remove the left-wing Sandinistas, they would not do the same for the government of Manuel Noriega in Panama, who had ruled the state since 1983. They would not take action against him until December 1989, during Operation Just Cause. Although he was a dictator, Noriega had made himself an ally of the U.S., supporting the Contras in Nicaragua. Nonetheless, many in the U.S. viewed him as a threat to U.S. interests in the region as well. The U.S. did not remove him from power until he became more of a liability than an asset in December of 1989, during the presidency of George H.W. Bush, Reagan's former VP. Noriega has been compared to other military dictators that are friendly with the U.S., at least for a time, like Augusto Pinochet in Chile. The U.S. interventions in Nicaragua and Panama demonstrated the pattern in U.S. Latin American diplomacy during the Cold War era, in which the U.S. would back authoritarian regimes that would support U.S. interests, at least temporarily. As far as domestic politics go, Reagan in his second term would continue most of the same policies that he had during his first period as president. Reagan continued to emphasize supply-side economics, intensify the war on drugs, as well as support issues that were important to his evangelical voter base, like the reintroduction of prayer in public schools. While Reagan's policies tended to turn to the right for the most part, one of his most famous policies, regarding immigration, swung more to the left. Reagan signed the Immigration and Control Act of 1986, which officially made it a crime to hire illegal immigrants. But the act also granted amnesty to about 3 million people who were illegally residing in the U.S. Reagan defended the act to critics from both the right and the left. He argued the criminalization of hiring illegal immigrants would slow undocumented immigration across the U.S. southern border by eliminating the pull factor of jobs within the U.S. He also argued that it was unfair to allow illegal immigrants to remain in the country without legal residency, and it would be better to give them legal residency rather than deporting them, as had been done in previous decades. Reagan signed the act for a variety of reasons, and to appeal to a variety of people. The act appealed to conservatives, since it levied penalties on businesses that hired illegal immigrants, and promised to slow future illegal immigration. The act also appealed to liberals, since it allowed 3 million people who had illegally entered the country to become legal residents, and even opened a pathway to citizenship for them as well. The act also appealed to business interests, especially farm owners, who wanted to have access to the labor of these previously illegal immigrants. Some of the most intense criticism of illegal immigration in the 20th century, and laws like the 1986 Act, came from labor groups, especially agricultural labor organizations. For example, the United Farm Workers Union, UFW, had opposed illegal undocumented immigration for years. Its leader, Cesar Chavez, even sent union personnel to patrol the U.S. border with Mexico to stop potential undocumented immigrants. Chavez had also opposed the Bracero program, a guest worker system which allowed workers from Mexico to work in the United States, seeing the program as a threat to Mexican-American farm workers in the U.S. Chavez and the UFW saw illegal immigrant workers as a threat to the wages of unionized farm workers, many of whom were Latino. The UFW and Chavez's power were both on the wane by the 1980s, but he did eventually throw his support behind the Immigration Control Act of 1986. But it is worth noting that not all Latinos in the U.S. have supported illegal immigration, or the liberalization of American immigration laws, as some people might think. Illegal immigration and its role in American labor and society will remain controversial for years to come. In the end, Ronald Reagan was a complex and nuanced political figure. He has been identified as a conservative by many for his tax cuts, his endorsement of supply-side economics, his slashing of welfare programs, and his aggressive foreign policy stance against the USSR. On the whole, his policies leaned to the right, but he also supported many policies that would be considered more left-leaning. While Reagan supported the war on drugs, he also called for drug treatment programs and increased awareness campaigns to educate people on the dangers of drug use. Reagan also increased spending on HIV/AIDS research, although critics said he should have allocated more funds for these studies than he did, and that he should not have pushed for abstinence-only sexual education. Reagan also signed into law one of the biggest amnesties in U.S. history as well. On the foreign policy front, while Reagan increased defense spending and pushed for the rollback of the USSR, he also signed several important arms reduction agreements with Gorbachev and the Soviets. Although Reagan was still more of a conservative, He supported policies that people on the political center and left could support, leading Reagan to be remembered positively by most Americans. And most scholars rank him as an above-average president. Reagan's popularity would also help to ensure that George H.W. Bush would be elected to the presidency in the 1988 elections. Bush ran on the strength of the economy and keeping Reagan's agenda going, and he attacked the Democratic nominee, the Democratic governor of Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis. The election was acrimonious, with both sides resorting to harsh, mudslinging attacks on each other, but Bush managed to win commandingly in both the popular and electoral votes. We'll talk more about George H.W. Bush and his presidency in our next video. Now that we've talked about U.S. politics and foreign affairs in the 1980s, let's consider American life and culture in the 80s. You probably recall that I said that Reagan won the youth vote in the 1984 election. This was a reflection of the popularity of conservative values amongst many young Americans. As you all know, young people usually like to repudiate the values of the generations that preceded them, and many young people, especially young white people, saw the embrace of conservatism as a way to rebel against the baby boomers who had supported liberal policies like the Great Society welfare programs of the 1960s. The popularity of conservatism could be seen in many aspects of American life. In media, portrayals of conservative ideas and people became more common. The NBC television sitcom Family Ties featured a liberal couple with a conservative and ambitious son set in Columbus, Ohio. In the show, Michael J. Fox played the part of Alex Keaton, a young, clean-cut conservative Republican who frequently sparred with his progressive hippie parents. The show's creators intended for their show to appeal to both older and younger demographics. Older viewers were meant to sympathize with Alex's parents, aging hippies who had seemingly gone mainstream and sold out, pursuing their careers, buying a home, and having children, all while trying to maintain the values of their youth. It was designed to show the generation gap between the mature baby boomers and their Generation X children, who were coming of age in the 1980s and were adopting the conservative values of the Reagan years, in stark contrast to the liberal values the boomers had supported as young adults. Viewers were meant to sympathize with Alex's parents, but many, especially younger viewers, identify with Alex, recognizing the similarities between themselves and this on-screen character. Alex came off as a greedy but lovable rogue, in a similar way that viewers had sympathized with the bigoted and buffoonish Archie Bunker in the 1970s, leading Alex to become the show's breakout character, bringing fame to Fox. Young people were rejecting the counterculture of the 1960s and 1970s, identifying it with the older generations, and instead embracing economic ambition, materialism, and conservative values, in some ways hearkening back to some of the ideals of the 1950s. 1950s nostalgia was strong in the 1980s, as it had been in the 1970s, as seen in the popularity of films like Back to the Future, which featured Michael J. Fox traveling back to the 1950s to save the 1980s, while television shows like Family Ties and films like Back to the Future showed the growth and popularity of conservatism. Music also showed young people's embrace of conservative values in contrast to the liberal and progressive ideas of previous generations. Technological advances to computer technology, especially the development of home computers, the personal computer by IBM in 1981, and the Macintosh by Apple Incorporated in 1984, increased the pace at which Americans could work, further strengthening the materialistic and consumeristic trends during the 1980s. Young people continued to listen to music, as they had done throughout the century, but technologies like the cassette tape, portable cassette players, which had become more common in the 80s, made listening to music cheaper and easier. Onto this expanding technological scene, the rock band Huey Lewis and the News released the song Hip to Be Square in 1986. Lewis, the band's lead, wrote that the song was meant to show the irony of Gen X embracing conservative values, but the song was very popular, especially amongst young people, who thought that Lewis was glorifying their conservative values and lifestyle. A year earlier, in 1985, the artist Madonna released the song Material Girl, which was meant to satirize the materialism of the Reagan generation, particularly that of Gen X women. The song was also meant to show the irony of the conservative, often consumerist values of the new generations. But young people generally liked the song for the same reason they liked Hip to Be Square. While the 1980s was a period of social commentary in music, it was also a time of new music styles and the continued fusion of mainstream American music with African American styles. As rock and roll, with its African American roots, became popular among white Americans, Black Americans continued to develop new genres, like Motown and hip-hop. One of the most important African American artists, and indeed one of the greatest American musicians of all time, Michael Jackson, mixed elements of rock, Motown, and hip-hop to create the pop music we know today. Jackson would become one of the most recognizable pop culture figures of all time, as fans eagerly purchased his albums, watched his music videos and concerts, and followed his personal life. While Jackson was not a conservative, he was an important cultural figure in American society, and met with both President Reagan and President Bush Sr. Jackson's legacy has since become more controversial. 1980s fashion demonstrated the adoption of conservative and materialistic values that had become vogue in American society, especially amongst young people. Expensive, designer brand clothing became more popular across the decade in reaction against the counterculture movement of the late 1960s and 1970s, which emphasized less expensive sartorial choices. Conspicuous consumption was all the rage in the 1980s, as both women and men began wearing flashy costume jewelry and branded clothing and accessories. Although fashion in the 1980s was greatly impacted by the conservative, ambitious, and materialistic values of the decade, how these values were expressed would change greatly across the 1980s. Fashion in the early 1980s tended to be subdued in reflection of the economic privations the nation was facing in 1981 and 1982. The colors were muted in a repudiation of the disco and glam styles of the 1970s as well. The styles of the early 1980s were also traditional. Young men began to wear business wear, even in casual settings. Many also adopted the preppy academic look as well. Women also began dressing in professional attire, partially to reflect the increased visibility of women in the workplace as a result of the feminist movement and elements of progressivism, but also to emphasize the importance of work and professionalism, conservative values. Hairstyles, especially for men, became more conservative as well, in reaction to the longer hair that was popular for men in the 1970s. In the mid-1980s, business and professional attire remained popular for both women and men, but styles and colors became more bright and exuberant to reflect the improving economic situation in the U.S. Exercise wear became more common in the 1980s, just as it had in the 1970s, and it also became more of a fashion statement as well. Business clothing and suits continued to be popular in women's fashion, taking cues from the style of Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister and important conservative leader. Women wanted to show their power in the workplace by wearing suits. Some of the suits even had reinforced shoulder pads to make their wearer appear stronger and more broad-shouldered. Men's fashion in the mid-1980s became more formal, in contrast to the casual styles of the 1970s. Men's casual wear, especially for African American males, was heavily influenced by the style of pop singer Michael Jackson. Men's casual styles also became more colorful, thanks to the popularity of TV shows like Miami Vice and Magnum PI. Hairstyles for the mid-1980s became longer, encouraging big hairstyles with lots of volume. These big hairstyles would become the norm for the rest of the decade. Late 1980s fashion was similar to the styles of the mid-80s, with the addition of parachute pants as worn by the hip-hop artist MC Hammer, demonstrating the growing visibility of African American music artists, and that their impact on American society had extended beyond just music. Combat boots also became popular in the late 80s, showing the connection between military service and masculinity for men, although these boots also became prevalent with women as well, indicative of the trend of growing female visibility in previously male spaces. Within these general style trends, there were numerous subcultures that had their own sense of style, as seen in the goth, punk, surfer, and skater styles, among many others. All in all, the 1980s was a landmark decade in U.S. history. It saw the election and policies of Ronald Reagan, one of the most important leaders in the American conservative movement, demonstrating a rightward shift in American politics that would continue for years after the decade ended. The 1980s also saw the creation of new political coalitions, as the Republican Party gained ground in the South and continued to build a coalition between white Southerners, evangelicals, and blue-collar whites across the country. The decade also saw a reversal of détente foreign policy, as Reagan and his successor, George H.W. Bush, took a harder line against the Soviet Union and America's other adversaries, leading to the USSR's eventual dissolution in 1991. On the domestic side of politics, modern conservatism, especially when it came to economic issues, became mainstream, leading many government spending and welfare programs to fall out of favor among young, right-leaning Americans. Culturally, the decade showed the clash between the young Generation X conservatives, the so-called Reagan generation, and the more liberal, counterculture-supporting baby boomers. This tension between liberalism and conservatism is especially evident in 1980s media and fashion.